Welcome, everyone. My name is Garrett Ayers. I'm a Virginia Seminary student and research assistant at the VTS Seminary, or Center for Anglican Communion Studies. I want to welcome you all today to our discussion, Indigenous Voices, Justice, and the Land. Today's webinar is hosted by Virginia Seminary's Center for Anglican Communion Studies, which exists to resource practices of reconciliation. This is done through international partnerships, programs, and publications that equip international community, empower intercultural leadership, and enrich Episcopal Anglican identity. The theme of the Center's program this whole year is the Anglican Communion, a movement for justice. So we are delighted to welcome two guests today who are eminently qualified to speak on this issue. With that said, I'd like to introduce our first guest today, Bishop Carol Gallagher. A member of the Cherokee Nation, the Right Reverend Dr. Carol J. Gallagher was ordained into the priesthood in 1990 and has served in 7 states with a view to building and sustaining relationships between the Episcopal Church and Native communities. In 2002, she was consecrated Bishop Suffragan in the Diocese of Southern Virginia, making her the first female Native American bishop of the Episcopal Church. She has served on the Episcopal Church Council on Indian Ministries, the Anglican Indigenous Network, the Anglican Peace and Justice Network, and the editorial board for the First Peoples Theology Journal. She has also, in the past, taught classes on Native peoples in the Episcopal Church at our own Virginia Theological Seminary. Bishop Gallagher holds a Master's in Divinity from Episcopal Divinity School, a Master's in Theology from Princeton Theological Seminary, and a PhD in Urban Affairs and Public Policy from the University of Delaware, and has published 2 books, Family Theology, Finding God in Very Human Relationships, and Reweaving the Sacred, a practical guide to change and growth for challenged congregations. Bishop Gallagher is speaking with us today from the Diocese of Massachusetts, where she currently serves as the regional canon of the Central Region. Finally, in her spare time, she offers prayers, encouragements, and reflections on her own blog, affectionately titled Mama Bishop. Welcome, Bishop Gallagher. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Good to be here.
Thank you, Garrett, and welcome, Bishop Gallagher. My name is Melina Desvod, and I'm a senior at VTS and a project assistant at the center. I am pleased to introduce Principal Reverend Katene Eruera. Principal Eruera is of Ignati Ho and Te Opori descent. He was ordained to the priesthood in 2003. Before his current position as principal of St. John's College, Eruera has held a variety of leadership, academic, and ministry positions. He worked as a barrister and solicitor. He served as deacon and priest, and worked as military chaplain in the New Zealand Defense Force, and served as Dean of Maori at St. John's College. His experience in law, chaplaincy, and ministry tie into his academic focus in the area of moral and practical theology, and his interest in how theological lenses may be applied for real-world application in order to heed Christ's call in the world. Principal Eruera holds a bachelor's degree in social anthropology and politics and a bachelor and master's of theology degree from the University of Auckland. And he received his law degree from Victoria University in Wellington. Currently, he's enrolled as a Doctor of Education candidate at the University of Auckland, and his research topic is an examination of Maori and Indigenous approaches to the Christian moral life, practical wisdom, and theological education for religious leadership. In his spare time, Principal Eruera developed a project called A Theology of Turangawaiwai, which can be used as educational resource for discussion, for preaching, and for further action. Welcome, Principal Eruera, and we are honored to have you with us today. Before we start with our conversation, I want to welcome all of our viewers. Today's conversation is taking place as a webinar on Zoom and is also being broadcasted live on YouTube and shared on Facebook. We will have almost an hour of conversation, and we'll be bringing in some questions from our audience towards the end. So we encourage you all to start submitting questions now through the Q&A portion on Zoom or in the chat and comment section on YouTube and Facebook. We will try to get to as many questions as possible, but we will, however, end promptly today at 6. So be sure to get your questions in early. So to begin, Principal Eruera, we know a little bit about your appointment as principal at St. John's. We know a little bit about your history as military chaplain and lawyer, but would you tell us a little bit more about your story? What are you passionate about? What are your priorities for ministries? And how have those passions led you to where you are now?
Hello, Melina. Could I first just acknowledge the Centre for Anglican Communion Studies, thank all of those involved in this webinar and for the invitation to engage with you in conversation today. It's a really good question. I'm going to answer in a very broad canvas to try and speak into it. I think my passion for ministry is really grounded in a lifelong search for a sense of positive human worth. What it means to be both Indigenous, both Maori and Christian, and trying to reconcile those two. I think I've done it. I think that I think I've found a way. But for me, I'm now in my early 50s, and I grew up in my context in the 1970s and 1980s, and that was a time of what we call here the Maori Renaissance. So just to give you some picture, in the mid-19th century, in 1840, a treaty was signed between Maori and the British Crown, which led to a process of colonisation in this country from the mid-19th century onwards. And quite a lot of stresses and challenges arose from that process for Maori. By the time of the 1970s and 1980s, a lot of generations had obviously had to deal and cope with those stresses and challenges. And when I was growing up, it was a time where our culture was endangered. We were losing our Indigenous language, and there were very negative stereotypes in the general idea of what it was to be Maori. And so in response to that, Maori began to reclaim the positive aspects of their identity, which is why we call it Maori Renaissance. So being brought up in that time, I experienced both the negative and the positive discourses. And so that's really influenced me in terms of what justice means in that context. So an example might be when I was growing up in the 1970s, we had just come out of a time where it was considered the norm to assimilate Maori into a wider European society. Those policies had just been rejected. So we're talking about generations of a policy of assimilation. And a shift towards a concept of biculturalism rather than assimilation. The idea that it is possible to affirm Maori culture, Maori language, Maori people, so that we critically reflect upon our history and say, there are negative things in our history, how do we make things better? So what am I passionate about? It's really sitting within that context. What does it mean to be Maori and the positive aspects of being Maori? Critically reflecting upon the history that has led to also some negative aspects of a wider society impacting upon us. How do I reconcile that with my Christian faith? Pushing through to some sort of idea that when we critically reflect upon the early involvement of the church in the process of colonisation, it's very easy to reject the church and to reject the Christian faith as something that has been imposed from the West upon us. But when you look carefully at the Maori response, you're actually finding the opposite, an embracing of Christian truth, an embracing of the gospel, and the ability to transcend that reality with a transcendent spiritual reality. So I think reconciling the two, that's one of the priorities I have for ministry as well. I'm now at a stage where I'm at a theological college, And I think my priority for ministry is to train the next generation of Maori theologians to take on leadership in the church. I better stop there, I think. Thank
That was
you.
wonderful. Bishop Gallagher, I'm going to offer you the same question. We have your CV, so to speak, but tell us more about your story, your journey. What are you passionate about? What are your priorities for ministry?
Thank you. And I'm really honored to be here with all of you. I have lived in the balance and the difficulty of living in two worlds. My family, my mother's family, the Walking Sticks. My mother was born in Oklahoma, but the Cherokee people, the Salagi, were originally from North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee area. There actually were some Cherokee settlements in Virginia as well. And we were subject to removal, forced removal in the 1830s. Although we had won a court case with the federal government that went all the way to the Supreme Court, the president at the time decided to ignore what the Supreme Court had said and marched us physically out of our homelands. So my community, my people had to start over again in a really much a foreign part of the world for them and rebuild. The Cherokee Nation now is very strong and very committed there to education and growth and tradition and language and culture. But that has not come without a great price. I mean, a lot of what the principal is saying is what our story is too. It was until the 70s in this country that we were actually allowed to have our religious freedom and to have some sense of autonomy as tribes. So we've really only been self-governing in this country since the late 70s. So there's been a lot of struggle, resurgence, identification issues in this country. We didn't have a Renaissance, but we did have the American Indian movement about the same time that the folks in New Zealand were, finding themselves as well. And people have often asked me, how can you be Christian and Native? And my people, the Cherokee people, many who walk the Trail of Tears were Christians at that point. There are stories about people singing hymns in Cherokee as they're being removed from their homeland. So I come from a long line of folks who are both Native and Christian, and struggling to explain that to some people in our church and in other churches. My dad was a Presbyterian minister, and so I grew up in a church household in a non-Native community because where he was called. And I often had to explain to people when my walking stick family was coming that no, indeed, they were not living in a teepee. So most of the American identity of Native people are either things people have seen in the movies or something that they've learned around Thanksgiving in their schools. So my whole life is spent with education and raising up Native leadership, because I think if we can be authentic in the midst of church and in the midst of our communities, we can really help people regain a sense of their belonging to God on this land, in this place, in this time, and how important that is. And I think that's particularly important as we face both this disease and this change of leadership in our country, to help people take hold of that sense of belonging and really having a sense of groundedness in who we are as both Christians and Indigenous peoples.
Wonderful, thanks. And I want to pick up on that language of belonging and ask a follow-up question. How is justice conceived of, or how is justice practiced within your community? And I think that language of belonging might point us in that direction.
Well, thank you. I think we, in most of our, and I don't, I'm going to back up just for a second. most of our tribes are unique and diverse, and so I don't speak for anybody except for my experience and my native experience. But there's a sense of justice and sense of belonging that has to do with the fact that the land is not something to own and control, but it's something that we are intimately part of. We are related to all of the known and unknown world, all integrated. And oftentimes one of the troubles in our world and with climate change and everything else is that sense of being different from, removed from, and the connectivity is very important for me to have a sense of the justice comes out of that relational life, which means that we have to think about how we are responsible for not only the people, but all living beings, and the environment around us. And I think justice comes right out of that root, at least for me, and our people, that as we protect the people and the land, so we're bringing justice to others.
Wonderful, thanks.
And Principal Eruera, I'll ask you the same question. How is justice conceived of, or how is justice practiced within your own community?
Thanks, Melina. Probably similar to Bishop Carroll, it's a relational process. Primarily justice in our church here is conceived of as social justice.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not isolated in that sense. We stand within a broader Christian tradition, even within the Anglican Communion, around the idea of social justice, the doing of social justice. So as we know, one of the 5 marks of mission is to seek to transform unjust structures. So I might pick up that thread because in the 1990s, what our church did here was critically reflect upon its own history in the light of being in relation to other people, a predominantly European church that still had a strong association with Maori. And what it did is it restructured in the 1990s to reflect some of the answers that it had found by looking at its own history. And in essence, what the restructuring did is it empowered 3 arms of the church. Firstly, the European arm, secondly, the Maori arm, but also then a Pacific arm, because historically our church extends up into some of the Pacific Islands. It was quite a significant shift because power, if you look at it in that context, traditionally sat within the European arm of the church. And it's a significant thing, I think, for anyone to give away their power, to actually say, my brother and sister in Christ, I am doing this so that you have as equal a voice in the decision-making of our church as we have had in the past. So from a relational exercise, if we think about what it does mean to be brothers and sisters in Christ, and being able to come together and to listen to the other, but not only listen to the other, that informs the way in which we try to live as a people of God. That to me was actually a significant and a powerful exercise of doing, reflecting on our critical past. The next level too is that the people of God, as Anglicans here in the restructuring, felt that not only is this a model for us in our context to live together, but isn't this a witness of our faith to our wider society as a whole? So it's actually been seen, social justice has been seen, we can do this not only internally as a people of God, but as a witness to all of New Zealand.
Thank you. And along those same lines, how then does your own Christian faith resource practices of justice for you? And then where do you see the church kind of getting in the way?
I'll chuckle, but I'll answer the question. I've reflected on this a little bit. I think critical thinking is so important, and theological education is so important in order for us to develop wisdom about what it means to live out our Christian faith. And so for me, it comes back to our theological method. What processes do we use in order to engage with our culture and with the gospel? So, for instance, I think we're blessed as Anglicans, as Episcopalians, because we're a denomination that's not afraid to ask questions and even challenging questions. And I think that's a gift. And then using a method to seek God's truth and knowing that we can only see in a mirror darkly, I think is again one of the gifts of what it is to be Anglican, to be Episcopalian. So for me, in that sense, contextual theology, the methods that apply to contextual theologies are hugely important for Maori and perhaps for all Indigenous peoples. Simply because if we take scripture, tradition, and reason as a valid theological method, it sits within, our church. It's a top-down method. It looks at scripture and tradition as the data from which we reflect upon issues or reflect upon our culture. But I think Maori theologians have, at least for the past 30 years, reversed that and used more of bottom-up methods. The data of what the lived experience of what it means to be Maori is, and then to reflect back on the gospel and our tradition. And I think that's borne much better fruit and much relevance for the gospel within our culture. So for me, what does a Christian faith resource means? It's a blessing to be Anglican. We're not afraid to ask questions. And it's a blessing to have this gift of theological method that allows us to critically reflect upon who we are.
Wonderful, thanks. And Bishop Gallagher, I want to give you a chance to answer the same question. So to rephrase it, or to repeat it, in what ways does Christian theology resource practices for you? And maybe the stickier question, where do you see the church/churches getting in the way?
Thank you. One of the struggles I've had with our traditional theological methods in both our seminaries, whether they're Anglican, Episcopal, or others, principle is already described. So I think we often struggle with the top-down methodology. The more dogmatic theologians, the more folks who are talking about God in the I, thou understanding, when we, as at least in my experience, in my communities, we're talking about us and the Creator, meaning in relationship, not devoid of relationship, not me alone, which is a very Western concept, but us in creation with God. And so part of the work I've done over the years is to help unpack theology so it's contextual for Indigenous folks, so that we can have conversations about our experience and how that relates to our understanding of God. There are some wonderful American Native theologians who've been doing some wonderful work. I had the opportunity several years ago to work with Bishop Stephen Charleston and a group of theologians who basically took the basic topics of Christian theology and wrote them from a Native perspective. And we wrote our various different pieces. I think I was assigned Sin and Redemption, which was very much fun. And then we actually sat around for days and talked through how we see things and, our experience and those kinds of things. And so that book, when it was published, for me was a real delight, because we could say that it was grounded in a community rather than in a building or an academy somewhere. And so I think the difference between here in the US, in the Episcopal Church here, is that we are so many different dioceses and so many different tribes. And it's been much harder for us to, in the raising up of leadership and the sharing of power as our church changes, and we go through a different leadership or those kinds of things. We haven't had as much consistency, and we've often looked to the Maori Church for some guidance on how we can help with the groundedness and the contextualization of theology.
Wonderful, thanks. So shifting topics a little bit, we want to give both of you a chance to speak about, and I guess continue to speak about land as it relates to theology, peoplehood, and specifically the Anglican Communion. So Bishop Gallagher, we'll start with you. First, how does your community tell the story of the land in its land? In a follow-up, in your experience, how do Episcopalians/Anglicans relate theologically to the land, and what sorts of shifts are needed? So to repeat, first, how does your community tell the story of the land? And then how do Episcopalians, Anglicans tell the story of the land, and what sort of shifts are needed?
The Cherokee creation story, and it's important to imagine what part of the world we are talking about in the Great Smoky Mountains. That the story goes in simple fashion that the sky arch, or maybe the other people would understand as the heavens, were getting crowded with all the animals and people, and it wasn't very comfortable, so they decided they had to do something else and find space. But at that point, the earth as we know it was covered in water, and so they finally decided that what they would do is send a beetle down on a line, dropped down, and the beetle would grab the wet, moist earth and pull it up from underneath the water, and that was fine, but it was still pretty wet and gooey. All of our creation stories are very practical and visceral, and so the conversation continued, and they decided that what needed to happen is there needed to be a bird sent to fly over and dry out the waters. And so the turkey buzzard, which has a huge wingspan, was the go-to bird. And so the turkey buzzard flew over the earth and dried it, but as it got tired, where its wings dropped down too low, that's where the Great Smoky Mountains and the other mountains were created. So that's, the beginning of our understanding in the land is very engaged and visceral, and understanding that we are created from the midst of it, but also people and animals working on a solution together. And trying to figure out how to manage something that was inhabitable and making it habitable. So the understanding of our land is that it has its own song and its own being and its own possession. I mean, it is an identity within all of us. And so understanding where we're located at any given time is very important in terms of, we may be Cherokees in Oklahoma, but it still is considered part of the essence of our being. Does that answer what you're?
Oh, that's perfect. That's perfect. And so then the follow-up for that question was, how do Episcopalians/Anglicans historically or presently relate theologically to the land, and what sort of shifts in your mind are needed?
Yeah, I think with the variety of different mission thrusts throughout the history of first the English colonies and other French and Spanish colonies to, what is now the Episcopal Church in the US and, the 9 provinces, is that I don't think our church thought a lot about land, but it was thought a lot about putting a church on, and running the Jamestown Charter includes a line, which is so when the English church first came among us in 1607, it said something to the effect of to bring the gospel to the savages who are suffering in darkness. So the understanding of the land was to, in some ways, conquer it and, put down roots and build churches. And I think one of the things we're struggling with now, that history has left us with lots of buildings that aren't being fully utilized, lots of land that isn't actually feeding the communities where they're located. And so I think one of the things I would love to see is people engaging in their understanding of where the land is, who the people are in the community, and changing around that ownership to that sense of shared understanding of using the resource for the entire community, that relational identity that, feeds everyone.
Thank you.
Principal, how about you? How does your community tell the story of its land? And in your experience, how do Episcopalians and Anglicans relate theologically to the land? And what sort of shifts are needed?
I might switch it around, Melina, if that's okay, and start with a broad context. New Zealand as a country is part of a modern global economy. So if you looked at it from that context, from beginning the process of colonization in the mid-19th century through to the present day, you can see land as a commodity. It's something to be sold, something to be leased, something to be cultivated, dug up, built upon, all those sorts of things. And I think there's a tradition within the Anglican Church that blesses that work. Because if you looked at the Book of Common Prayer, for example, you would find a blessing for a harvest. So I think there is that strong theological tradition still within the Anglican Church that sees the productivity of land and how the benefits flow from that land. But contrast that with the big issues of our day, climate crisis. There must be more ways of telling the story of land. And I think given what's happening with the environment, those stories are now more important than ever. And certainly this is where I think Indigenous perspectives and Maori wisdom traditions are really, really important in offering a different voice into seeing land other than as a commodity. So within, for instance, the Maori wisdom traditions, land is definitely not a commodity. If we looked at the Maori wisdom tradition, land essentially is sort of like Earth Mother. It could be seen as a deity. And so from that deity, there's certain genealogies, certain that derive from the divine. And so everything in that framework is seen as interrelated. I am related somehow to all living creatures and in the land, but also not as an individual, as part of a community. Again, I think like what Bishop Carroll is referring to, in the traditional wisdom tradition, it's impossible to see myself as an individual. I belong to a group of peoples who belong to a particular part of the land, and there is responsibilities tied into how we care for that land and how we are guardians of that particular piece of land. That's probably a lot of theological shifts that need to happen within the church. And in that way, we're actually not isolated from the broader problems that are coming through with environmental crisis, the diminishing of biodiversity. It's a relevant time to start expanding our view and to start hearing different voices about the care of creation.
Thank you. And I guess to kind of stay with this topic, in light of these shifts, which I know you mentioned a little bit before about the bottom to the top approach, how have churches sought to redress land injustice? Or I guess another way of asking this is, where do you see promise for restoration, or do you?
Yeah, I do see promise for restoration. In our context, the church has also influenced, I think, the way in which wider society thinks. There was one main treaty that was signed in 1840 between British and Maori. And for many, many generations, that treaty was pretty much ignored. There was a very important court case here in the 1870s, which described it as a simple nullity. That was overturned in 1986, so that's over 100 years later, where the court looked at it again and said, actually, no, this is not a simple nullity. This treaty governs the relationship between government and Maori. And one of the ways we can look at that relationship is, what does partnership between peoples look like? So that was quite a pivotal sort of moment. And the reason why the churches were involved in that is because the churches in 1840 were the key mediators and the key translators for Maori as they entered into the signing of this treaty. So there was always felt from the 1970s onwards, the churches felt that they had an obligation to honour what was entered into in 1840, because they were pivotal in Maori agreeing to sign that treaty. So what has it led to? It's led to very serious conversations about reparations, and it has led to significant treaty settlements for tribes throughout the country. In essence, trying to re-establish an economic base for peoples. And in some parts of the country, that has become a success story for Māori. So, for instance, the generation that are now in their 20s are increasingly experienced in business. They're innovative. They're leaders in their own right. Whereas when I was growing up, it was a rarity. We were a minority in that sense amongst our own people. So it's wonderful to see. Where do I see the promise of restoration for the church? Again, I've mentioned our restructuring. I think that's a significant action to restore. But there are concrete things we are doing as well. Recently, we returned land that had been owned by the church. When we carefully looked at its history, we realised that the purpose for which Māori had gifted it to the church was no longer needed for generations for that purpose. So, again, that was returned. But also there are significant lay people in our church who are either in government or can shape and influence the way in which partnership is perceived. So very general, broad brush strokes, but yeah, I'll answer it in that way. Thank you.
Bishop Gallagher, I'm wondering what you think. In your experience, how have churches sought to redress land injustices? Do you see promise for restoration? And if so, where?
Well, I see promise for restoration. Just like Katene, I think we're particularly here in this continent. It's a very slow and varied process, because there are so many treaties, so many broken treaties, and our church relation. I'll go back to the tribes in Jamestown and the tribes in Virginia. The original tribes that welcomed our church all had treaties with the crown. So when we became the United States, when we separated from the crown, all those treaties were nullified. And they basically spent generations ignoring any relations with the tribes. And so depending on where you are in this country, depends a lot on what treaties were set up and all those kinds of things. So, for us, it varies from place to place about what both the government and the people are doing about land restoration. But I've got to say there are a couple encouraging pieces that the church and local governments are working on. I mean, one was, and lots of attention to that, to the water protectors. A couple of years ago in the Dakotas and the pipeline, many people from the Episcopal Church and across the country got involved in the preservation of that, and also in the Arctic Wildlife Rescue, the ANWR, to fight against all of the push to for the drilling. Unfortunately, that is sort of rearing its ugly head again, but I think there's a sentiment, a very changing sentiment in this country to preserve tribal and herd lands, and then to also be able to talk about what it means to return lands. We're probably considerably behind the Maori and others in that conversation and reparations. But I think I have seen in the past 8 or 10 years, much of the church wanting to figure out how to honor Native lands. And some of that is also the rise of Native and Indigenous leaders in various places in our government. As you've seen, we have many more Congress people, many more leaders in government in various, both in the state, local, but also in our federal government. And I think that really changes the way people understand things. There's a lot of education to be done.
Great, thank you. And thank you both. So we are going to shift into the Q&A portion. We've got a few minutes here. And this question I'm going to offer up to both of you. It's a question that we've got, and it says, how can engaging with both the history and the present situation of stolen land help particular congregations to enter into better relationships with the land itself and with Indigenous people who may live nearby? So how do we engage with the history, and how does engaging with that history enable congregations to enter into better relationships with the land itself and with Indigenous people nearby? What are the best and most helpful ways of engaging this issue at a local parish level? Principal Katene, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Garrett. I found in my ministry that the telling of stories and having people who are willing to listen to those stories is a powerful healing experience. And sometimes when you tell your own story as a people, when people are also hearing that for the very first time, there is a shift in perspective about their own story sitting within the same part of land. I think if we somehow as Christians create the space to allow that dialogue to happen, then that is an important and significant step in truly trying to live as brothers and sisters in Christ.
Thank you. Bishop Gallagher?
I agree entirely. I mean, I would, I often invite us to think about Native theology as a narrative theology, Indigenous theology as a storytelling. And the powerful stories of people. I live in a state where there are easily 30,000 Indigenous people living here, and most people would say there are no Native people here. And that's a fairly common, perception from the larger public. But once they hear a story, once people can engage with someone's people's story, it really does change. And if we can find ways to, traditionally, we are always people of invitation and hospitality, and if we can invite people into that place of listening and sharing stories. I think that's the bedrock of where we can build from.
Thank you.
Thank you both. We have another question from a viewer, the Reverend Jean Coddington. She asks, too often we Euro-Americans rush in trying to fix things that accommodate our sensibilities and agendas, and we actually make things far worse. What do white people need to do or not to do to support healing? From the Indigenous perspective, what do we need to do for repentance? And what do we need to look at?
Hmm. Do you want me to start with this?
If you would like to, yeah. Please.
I for one don't like to tell people what to do unless they're my family. But the reality is understanding that Native people are as complex and varied, and our Indigenous people across this land are of various different expressions and needs. And I think engaging with people both in a place of listening and perceiving and hanging out with is one of the best things we can do. I'm always reminded of a story my mentor, Awana Anderson, used to tell. We were at a speaking engagement somewhere, and somebody asked, because they were trying to do the right thing. They wanted to know how to refer to us. And, you know, it was probably in the early 90s. And they said, we know that the name Indian isn't right and with this and that, but how do we refer to you? And she explained that, you know, most likely in this country, it's best to refer, you know, to person as their, by their tribal group. But she said, you know, all of the names like Native American, if you're born here, you're Native American, it, you know, Indians, and Columbus was looking for a route to India, and that's why we were named Indians. And she said, it's just really a good thing that Columbus wasn't looking for Turkey. And she left it at that. So, I mean, I think one of the things is to understand that this is really complicated and awkward. And it's really okay to, we're all going to stumble around in the dark anytime we do really intentional, healthy relationship building. There's a lot of misunderstanding, and it's okay to ask questions and say, I don't understand, because we really, we're not invited by God to fix other people. We're invited by God to love one another. I mean, the Christian mission is about loving our neighbors, loving one another. And that's hard and complex and awkward work.
Mm.
So we've got another question. This is for both of you. I think it'd be great kind of summary really of a lot of these topics. How does land use or your relationship to the land affect your daily, weekly spiritual practice? So how does land evolve itself into your spiritual life? Bishop Gallagher, why don't we start with you?
Okay. I come from a long line of gardeners. I guess you'd call them that. Not really farmers as much as my grandpa Walking Stick was very much raised vegetables and, you know, did all sorts of things and taught me how to work in the garden. And I think there's that very real and important part of my life that's about seeding, reseeding, helping both beauty and food rise, you know, be part of who we are. Not like mega farming as much as, you know, raising and caring for people and the earth by engaging daily in that life work. So I have this visual, and I realize that my back porch looks somewhat the same because there are always dried seeds hanging all over the place, for the next season. And for me, that is the full engagement of who we are in restoring the land and working with our hands and not always getting it right, but trying to push forward the positivity of life.
Thank you. Principal Katene, what do you think?
I think for me, land is important in this way. It gives me a sense of identity, a sense of home, and a sense of belonging. Now, in our history as Maori since colonisation, there have been really two kinds of displacements. We may have lost land for reasons of war in the mid-19th century by way of confiscation. We may have lost land by way of policy. For instance, land might be taken to build a railway line, things like that. But irrespective of that, there are still portions of land which are still owned by peoples, by tribes. And I'll give you an example. If someone were to pass away here in Auckland, Auckland being the biggest city in New Zealand, and they were Māori, the first question we would ask is, where does this person come from? It's not so much about us attending to this person, although that's really key. It's us attending to this person knowing that they belong somewhere, and our job is to get them home to their people. So my spirituality connected to land is really, again, around that sense of identity, of home, and of belonging. Ultimately, under the blessing of God.
Thank you. Thank you to our viewers for sending in such deep and powerful questions. But to make sure we end on time, we're going to shift to the last portion of our conversation today. We have one final question for the both of you. So I'll start with Principal Katene. As we close, what would you like to leave with viewers? What would you like us to think about and know as we log off?
Thanks, Melina. Look, this is not an original thought. It's not mine. But we do live in a moral universe that will always bend towards the good. And if we seek to aspire to live on earth as in heaven, then social justice in that framework with Indigenous peoples is really, I think, rooted in what the church's story is within our particular contexts. We need to have a critical perspective about truth, reflecting back upon that history. And there are themes, I think, coming out of our context, and I think from what Bishop Carroll is saying from her context as well. What does reconciliation, what does forgiveness look like between peoples? And I think we can't seek true justice without a critical mind, a listening ear to the other, and a willingness to share in the stories that eventually lead to just action. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bishop Gallagher, what about you? We'll give you the last word. What would you like to leave viewers with?
That is very dangerous. I think that because of the both similarities and variety of expressions of Indigenous people, to realize that there is much work of justice to go on, much social justice to work on for Indigenous people. But for me, it's based always in our relationship together, our willingness to sit down and listen and abide, and the reconciliation, as Katene is talking about, is our, it seems to me, my call and our call in Christ, this willingness to always be reconciled. None of us could have expected the pandemic that we're in. How do we reconcile, this virtual universe? How do we reconcile, or do we just give up and be frustrated? It's very easy. There's so much to do. There's so many people to care for, but we can, in our own places, in our own communities, our own, work on reconciliation and healing. Sometimes that just means being willing to pray for people who don't understand. Sometimes it means seeking folks out. And there's a lot of, opportunity for all of us to be doing that even while we're completely virtual. And so I think what the message I'd like to leave, I think is very similar, that God is pushing us to a place of opening our hearts to others and realizing that how our hearts are changed by others only makes us increase. It increases all of us if we can see through another's eyes, hear and feel another's heart. So, and I'm grateful to be here with all of you. So thank you.
What a great place to end. I want to thank our distinguished guests for a wonderful and hopeful conversation. Thank you, Bishop Gallagher, and thank you, Principal Eruera. And a big thank you to all of you for tuning in and for your thoughtful questions. As we end, we just want to remind you that our next event at the Center for Anglican Communion Studies will be a webinar that will be held on Tuesday, February 16th at 12:45 Eastern Time. The subject will be trauma, healing, and justice, and our guest will be Father Michael Lapsey, founder of the Institute for Healing of Memories in South Africa. So please do join us for another insightful conversation. Thank you, everyone.